Hello, everyone. It's such a great pleasure to welcome you to our video interview with the authors of, first authors of the Editor's Choice papers for the British Journal of Social Work volume 53, issue 4. I will mention the authors of the papers and their colleagues who are not all with us in alphabetical order. So it's my great pleasure to welcome here Yohai Hakak, who is from the Department of Health Sciences at Brunel University of London. He wrote a paper with colleagues Shirley Onoka, and who is from Swindon Borough Council in Swindon in adult social care, and Cornella Shishane, who is from University of Bedfordshire in Luton, also in UK. And their paper title is People Here Are Their Own Gods, the Migration of South African Social Workers to England. Next paper was written by Corina Modderman, who is here with us today from La Trobe University in Shepparton in Victoria in Australia, who wrote a paper with colleagues Michelle Mehanon, Lynn McPherson and Guinevere Treckeld, all from La Trobe University also. And the paper title is Critical Reflective Learning in Social Work Graduate Research, Learnings from an Australian Study in Child Protection Service Delivery. And finally, last but not least, Kate Vincent, because we're going through authors in alphabetical order, Kate Vincent from University of Tasmania in Australia, with the title of paper, Unveiling Whiteness with Organizations Working with People with Refugee Backgrounds. It's such a great pleasure to have you all here today. So to start us off, if we talk a bit about what motivated your research, and once again in alphabetical order, Yohai, if we start with you and your colleagues' work.
Sure. Well, I am a migrating social worker myself.
Same.
I did my PhD and postdoc work in Israel, but then we moved to here. Largely, in Israel is a really small country, and normally in order to get an academic position, you need to spend a few years abroad. So this is what I did. We didn't really think of migration. But things turned out this way, and as a migrating we decided to stay. But so as a migrating social worker myself, I was constantly in the place of trying to decipher this new world that I was thrown into. And indeed, I wasn't practicing social worker, but I was teaching social work and trying to adjust myself to this new world, new system. And very early on, I knew that the way I saw things were very strongly influenced by the kind of culture I was brought up in. So this is how things have started for me.
What led to South Africa? What led to South Africa, though? Because the study focuses on experience of South African social work.
Yes. The interest in migration and bubbled for a few years, and what actually happened was that I had no time to do any research in my work. and the only solution was and I was still supervising endless number of dissertations every year, master's dissertations, and I was always frustrated by the fact that they never seemed to go anywhere. That students spend a lot of time and energy producing work that then stays on a shelf. And so somehow these two issues, I decided to try and tackle both. So I thought that if I approach working with students in a very different way, something more fruitful might come out of it. And I guess this is what happened. I just started working with students, in a very different way from really early on. And this turned into a series of studies on the migration of social workers from quite a range of countries. And surprisingly, we managed to publish a lot. So yeah, this is how it started.
It's a topic of growing interest because there is more migration of social workers, not just into UK, but from a range of countries and into a range of countries. Corina, what was the journey to your study?
Yeah, so I'm a Dutch white social worker, and I qualified in the Netherlands. I was brought up in the Netherlands, and then I came to the UK, to Wales, to work in child protection there. And from Wales, my husband and I decided to migrate to Australia. And then somehow, I worked in child protection here. I could do a bit of guest lecturing, and I got into university, and I had the opportunity to do a PhD. So my PhD was about transnational social workers that are recruited from the UK specifically to Australia. Similar to myself, even though I'm Dutch, but similar trajectory. And I interviewed quite a few social workers from the UK who were quite stressed being in Australia and found it really hard to adjust to the Australian system of child protection service delivery. I published 4 papers about that study. And the final paper was finally about how white people coming to Australia, what's their understanding of Aboriginal people. This is a subject that in Australia, a lot of people tiptoe around. Find it very scary to write about that. So after those 4 papers and the PhD was done, we said, hey, there's actually another paper in this whole study. And this is how in graduate research, we still continue with this colonial view of the world, this white way that we do research in the academy. And I found it a very scary paper to write because I was complicit as well. I did not have a good understanding when I came to Australia. And actually, when I looked at the narratives that I created during research interviews, I was just saying maybe not as awful things as some of the participants said, but it was quite racist in some aspects as well. So it was a journey of kind of like understanding how white I am myself, and by looking in the mirror about myself, writing about that process to coming to the point where I'm now. And that's really what this paper is about, I think.
Very clear links about exploring and it's so important that we have those difficult reflections and conversations about who we are, what happens in those spaces where different cultures intersect, whether within a single country or internationally.
Yeah, and and we talk probably more about it, but when I actually looked at what I did and how my PhD progressed, I thought, oh dear, I am doing the same as a white person. And, it's not about the other. It's not about, getting knowledge about the others, actually really looking at yourself as a person and as a professional and as an emerging researcher.
Absolutely. And committing those difficult thoughts, which can feel very intimate and exposing.
Unpleasant, very unpleasant.
Share them with the world.
Yes, and it's not something that has a finish either. You can't say, okay, now I've done this, now I've done my decolonizing, now I'm done for the rest of this will continue to go because we slip back in our Eurocentric thing. We can't erase that. So that's also who I am, but it's a journey that continues to go. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And which really brings us nicely to Kate's paper. So what motivated your paper?
Yeah, so thank you. This paper came out of my wider PhD research, which was conducted starting in 2015. So that wider project came about through, my PhD supervisor, Dr Jocelyn Bolcher-Ua, here at University of Tasmania, is an expert in whiteness and decolonisation and refugee resettlement, and she, in her work, had really noticed that there was this big gap in understanding whiteness and what it actually looks like. What are the concrete examples of it in the day-to-day, especially in social work, which is such a white Western profession here in Australia. That's where it came from here in Australia, and there's just nothing, it's just not being talked about. and it's sort of going kind of unnoticed or unacknowledged a lot of the time. So that's where this project came out of, and the findings in this paper are just kind of one chapter of that wider paper, which looked at how whiteness, so I worked with white social workers here in Tasmania who identified as white and who worked with refugee-arrived communities to learn about how they interpreted and understood whiteness to manifest and operationalised in their organisations. And as a white Euro-Australian myself, I did want that to be a project where we looked at whiteness, where white people were the ones being asked to be involved in this, in the hope that it could also be a process of racial consciousness raising, because it is white people that need to do that work. We're the problem, and in terms of white supremacy culture and white privilege. So that was kind of how this study came about, to be a study, but also be the study that it did become.
Amazing. And really, I hope that also clarifies why and how the 3 papers were selected together, because in different ways and across different contexts, they talk to each other in different ways. So very briefly, to talk about methodologies to engage with these topics, which in their nature are complex and difficult to explore. And Yohai, you mentioned that you worked with your master's students through their dissertation work. So which kind of methodologies were engaged in their studies?
So in our case, we used a mixed method. So we used questionnaires and interviews. In some cases, we used focus groups. We were hoping to use some other methods, but these are, time didn't allow. But we used those in a way that, again, shortage of time, in a way that the both elements only fed into the data analysis. So often people start with some exploratory qualitative work, and then they identify variables and then conduct those questionnaires or surveys. But we didn't have the time to go with these different stages. So we had certain issues that we thought would be interesting to try and quantify. And basically we deployed both methods at the same time. And at the end, they helped us to see certain issues just at a greater scale. And I think it worked well. Yeah.
And what were the questions that you focused on, and how were they devised, and how did they emerge?
We very quickly on, from reading the literature, we realized that, there were some key problems in the existing literature. For a variety of reasons, scholars either looked at migrating social workers as one homogeneous group, or people, regardless of the country they came from, they all lumped them together and studied them together, and then tried to come up with, I don't know, often themes that were very psychological, so very little attention to culture. If they did looked at migrating social workers from specific countries, then still there was very little attention to the culture that people were coming from, and often also to the culture that people were going into. And I can only suggest that maybe this is part of the limited attention in our discipline to those issues, cultural issues, and so we try to avoid that from the start.
And it might be more of a conversation for the kind of key findings to emerge, but it's not just a singular culture, even if we talk just about, say, England rather than all of UK or South Africa, because there were so many subcultures and different cultural, ethnic and racial groups which all coexist with different
Yeah.
levels of homogeneity and
Absolutely.
heterogeneity within a single geographical space as well. To
Absolutely.
consider within that. Yeah. Thank you. And Corina, which method?
Yes, so I have it open, of course. I was just looking at it. Because I had the numbers, but well, this is a qualitative study, and really focused on how can a critical, informed, reflective learning strengthen social work graduate research in the context of Australian child protection service delivery. So the data set I was drawing from were on my own notes. So I had 49 diary entries. You know, when I had an interview, I would write an interview notes after, you know, with my thoughts, my feelings across, you know, throughout the PhD. My supervisor had me writing reflective notes. So I looked at those. Then I had 68 draft manuscripts. So, you know, when you do a PhD, endless cycles of feedback from your supervisors. I had brilliant supervisors, but sometimes I was like, oh, I can't do it anymore. But now, you know, I still had all those drafts and I could see how it evolved. And then I had 75 supervision files that I saved throughout the years. And I had two phases. So first looking at themes in that data set. And in the second phase, so that's deductive and then inductive, looking through the lens from Gillian Roos. Do I say that right?
Gillian Roos,
yes. Okay. Yeah, Gillian Roos, yes. So her model around reflective learning, the 4 phases, I use that theoretical lens to look at the themes, and that's how the findings are presented. Wow. Yeah, it was very uncomfortable to read all of that, your own notes, you know, because it's such a journey, a PhD, and how you write in the beginning to what you see later, and really that transition from practitioner, you know, to you know, and a researcher is really evident in those notes. Yeah.
What struck you most through that? If you can single out 1 or 2 things.
I was so nervous to talk to research participants, and you know, I worked in child protection. I can talk about anything with people, their private lives, you know, the things that we you know, I social work in child. Anything we talk about, really personal stuff, abuse. And here I'm sitting with my researcher's hat on, really nervous. Like, oh, I think this is my bread and butter. This is what I'm good at. Yeah. But that shift in identity of I'm not sitting there as a social work practitioner, but a social work researcher. In the beginning, I really had to find that new identity. It's really strange.
And it's important that we talk about all those experiences because they're almost universally shared sometimes.
Yes, and you know, in the beginning, I was just doing, like, even in my interviews, a risk assessment. You know, I ask a question, you give an answer, and I move through my set of questions. I did narrative research, and you know, where you really engage and you know, go deeper. Yeah, so that learning, seeing habits, awareness of those habits as well. Yes. Yeah.
And Kate, which methods do you use? And you drew on your PhD work, so this is part of a broader.
Broader. Yeah. So the broader project, it was mixed methods also. So there wasn't really anything that I knew. You know, I read a lot about how do we engage white people in discussions about whiteness, and I was teaching at the time, you know, to nursing students about cultural responsiveness. So I was kind of looking at a lot of education material around how do you actually have conversations, and so I really took a relational and dialogical approach where so I did an initial interview to kind of just build relationship, get an understanding of what people thought about whiteness and what they already knew, make sure that we could start to get a bit comfortable to talk about something really uncomfortable. Then they went away for a couple of months with materials that I'd put together for them, so videos and educational resources that helped give them a vocabulary and also more information about whiteness. And then I brought them together for focus groups where they were able to talk about what they had started to think about now that they were understanding more about what whiteness is. And then I did one-on-one interviews again, where we kind of took practice examples to deconstruct what was actually happening there. And if we were to do them again, where we were kind of trying to take a decolonizing lens and not letting whiteness get in the way, what would we do? How would they do those? And so that's what got the data. And then I analysed it using a critical approach to narrative analysis and ended up with 666 stories that I analysed line by line.
That's a lot of data.
Wow.
And which
Yeah.
approach did you take to analysing so much data?
Yeah, so with the narrative analysis, so I broke every within every transcript, I would see what is an actual story within that discussion. So, you know, we might, within 5 minutes, maybe we had just stuck on one story, or maybe like we moved on to a new narrative. And so then that helped me kind of, I used this critical lens of actually, once I knew what my stories were, I gave them all a name and a number, and then asked critical questions of the stories. You know, I had this sort of template of what am I wanting to know? How is power? You know, really making sure it was a critical analysis of those. And I won't get into the nitty-gritties, but I'm a very visual person, so I printed out I cut all my stories up. I had this whole boardroom booked for the day, and I did weird things with sticky tape and different pieces of paper and whiteboards that probably they're probably the works of a crazy person at the time, but they just helped me to kind of figure out what the themes were that I was constructing.
That sounds very familiar. I had similar wall in the PhD days myself, and all the neighbors wondered what on earth is going on, because there were all these
Yeah.
But it's really helpful tool to kind of figure out.
I just have to do it. I know it's not environmentally friendly, but it was my process, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And when we come now to the findings, what do you feel, Yohai, is the main kind of core findings that are relevant to emphasize? Although we would want to encourage everyone to read all 3 papers, and I hope this is a good invitation for it. But just as a teaser, what would be the key findings that would be good to emphasize and their relevance to social work in UK and elsewhere?
Well, in the case of the migration of South African social workers, what we found was that religion was playing a very central role. We understand that religion played a very central role also for the apartheid regime, and that the apartheid used religion with both Black and white South Africans. And even though that apartheid was dismantled several decades ago, the impact of apartheid is still sort of lingering. And in any kind of studies that are measuring religiosity in South Africa, you will see that the percentage of people that talk about religion as very central to their lives is about 4 times bigger than the UK. So it's a much more religious country. So this has a very strong impact on a range of issues, starting from how people view parenting, relationships, marriage, a range of issues, gender relations. And so social workers who came from South Africa to here had, first of all, to adjust to the fact that even talking about religion was seen as something that is very questionable, let alone mentioning it in definitely not with clients, but even with colleagues. They felt that they were very quickly sort of either criticized or ridiculed or questioned. So this was one major issue that had wide-ranging implications. Other issues were around this sense of Ubuntu or belonging to a wider family community, and me being here is thanks to the people back home that all united to support me, and that I am still part of that, and I'm contributing to that, and I have a responsibility for them, compared to the very individualistic and sort of in a way isolated kind of living that they came across here. You know, one of them mentioned that we talk about in social work, child protection or children and family social work, we talk about the power of the family, whereas from her perspective, she was thinking, God, what happened to the families here in the UK? Why are they so disintegrated and so limited connection between people? At least this is how it was seen through her eyes. Another issue that came across not only for this group, but for quite a few other groups, is around politeness and how we define what is polite and impolite behavior, and this very, very particular reserve and kind of scholars in this area. Well, another thing that I didn't know, that there is a whole discipline called politeness studies. Would you believe that? And that scholars in this area talk about English politeness as they define it as negative politeness. And what they mean by that is that it's a kind of politeness that is defined largely by what people are meant not to be doing, not to intrude, not to impose, not to interfere in other people's business, compared to what they define as negative politeness, where this is more about making other people feel welcome and warm. And so the simple distinction between my house is my castle and mi casa su casa, you know, come and knock on my door, I'll come, the polite thing would be to let you in, give you a glass of water and, you know, whatever. But the other, in English culture, the polite thing would be, don't come knocking on my door unannounced, you know, so all of these issues had a huge impact, but generally it's the importance of culture and how we need to consider that when we bring people and help them adjust.
And how also coming into a country, we tend to also as immigrants generalize from the context where we are, because also across different parts of the 4 countries of UK and in different parts of even just one of them, England is the largest, there is so many different ways that culture plays out, and there are so many different cultures, and intersectionality becomes even more important in that respect. But it's important to start voicing and having those conversations and studies and insights into experiences we have across the board. So this is why all of your work is so crucial. And Corina, moving on to your work, what would be the kind of highlights that you would want to share?
Well, I think, you know, in Australia, we talk a lot about decolonizing practices in social work, but do we really do it? Is it talk, or do we really do it? And if you really do it, it's uncomfortable, and there's a lot of shame, I think. I felt a lot of shame when I really looked at myself. So I think we can't start decolonizing if we really don't look at ourselves and what we bring. And I think we see that in the academy, which is a very wide institution. And I remember when I started writing my final PhD people about First Nations people and child protection and transnational social workers, I wrote in the past. And my co-author, Dr. Michelle, who's also a dear friend of mine and a proud Yorta woman, she was furious. She said, why are you writing about this in the past tense? I said, well, colonization is over. She said, no, it's not over. It's still existing here in Australia. Open your eyes. It's everywhere. And I thought, oh, yes, you are right. I'm looking as a white woman and the privileges that I have in my life, that I don't experience this racism. So I think that was... that is really important to actually become aware that, you know, there's different worldviews. There's other ways of knowing, there's other ways of being, there's other ways of doing, and that you really have to open your mind. It's not about other people educating me. I have to educate myself, and I have to look at self. And I think it also, you know, as PhD, as teams, supervisory teams, we can easily become, this is the way we do it, because this is what is expected from us. And when I published, you know, in the beginning, I didn't want to start my publications with telling who I am, what country I'm from, what the surroundings look like. But my Aboriginal colleagues, again, was very firm. She said, if Aboriginal people read this, they want to know, who is this woman? Where's she from? And then, do you actually cite Aboriginal people in your papers, you know, or do you just cite white people talking about Aboriginal people? So I think making space, moving away from that white fragility, you know, we have to have some, we need a wake-up call sometimes to say, okay, I'm doing this wrong, or I'm taking too much space, or I have to make space. And I think in graduate research and social work, that's really important. Yeah, and in child protection service delivery, of course, as we know, in Australia, we have lots of issues there. So it's ongoing work, and it doesn't have a start and it doesn't have an ending.
Absolutely. It's something that we definitely need to continue exploring, and
yeah,
yes, conversation to keep talking about, to be researching it.
Yeah, and it's more than just talk. It's everything that we do, I think. It's just, yeah, everything. Yeah.
Our knowledge needs to be acknowledge where the boundaries and how our whiteness shapes it.
Yes.
Much more than our diversity. And what does that mean for our research going forward?
Yeah, absolutely.
Which brings us so ever so nicely to Kate and your research and what you would want to emphasize from this part of your PhD.
Yeah, definitely. So I really went into this wanting, this wasn't what I was studying as such, but I did want there to be an increased awareness and some change with the social workers that I worked with. And interestingly, a lot of them really did have an understanding of what whiteness was. They had, most of them, because of that interest in this already, they were the kind of people who wanted to be involved in the study. So surprisingly, they did come to that first interview with lots of thoughts on how whiteness was, how they'd already seen whiteness operate. And then they did get more and more, you know, they gave more and more examples, and they included things like, and I won't give too much away, so hopefully people will read the paper, but things like one size fits all approaches to service delivery, you know, the closure periods that we have being really set for like white Western people's holidays, and, you know, being so worried about clients over the summer break because they were so disconnected from services, and it was the time that was just so lonely. And whereas a lot of people were that were, you know, had already settled here, had family and festivities to do, and things like the way that physical spaces were constructed, you know, for the comfort of white Western, for those Euro-Australian workers and the white service users at the expense of others. And sorry, sorry, I feel like
it's
I can hear a
okay.
little bit.
Yeah, there was a little bit of a feedback, but it's okay.
Sorry.
In the background. No, it's
I'm
fine.
not very good at talking with. So yeah, those physical spaces actually felt like spaces of interrogation, as opposed to what the workers were thinking were really comfortable, because they were comfortable. But you know, when they actually got to talking with the people that were using them, they felt it was taking them back to times where they've had to tell their story to someone who's documenting that for safe passage somewhere. And also, you know, the climates and the cultures within organisations, white people being those that got most likely to be employed because of the skills that they were looking for, computer literacy, those kind of things. So that was a big finding. But what was really interesting is that a lot of the participants talked about their discomfort about knowing these things. So they knew it, they were uncomfortable, yet they had said nothing because, like you were saying, Corina, they didn't have the skills. They didn't know how to have the to sit with the discomfort. They didn't know how to address it. They were worried about talking to leadership. They worried about their job, about who they were, especially in the medical space in relation to the hierarchy, of feeling like, you know, what they should be picking their moments, or they shouldn't be troublemakers. And so I think that was one of the big findings, is that knowing about whiteness doesn't mean that you will do something. And that's a really big finding, because it makes us know that we need more skills in how do we do that. And also maybe we shouldn't be the ones who run these organizations, you know, maybe we need a real restructure and just a shake up of how organizations look, so that it's not white Western people that are in charge of working with people, resettling people, or people who have successfully felt comfortable in that resettlement process, are the ones who take the lead, and so we can stop affirming whiteness that way. So yeah.
Particularly when it comes to core decisions around funding spaces, what they look like,
Absolutely.
that it's a more community approach, and that kind of
Yes.
culture and community culture is something that has been so lost from so many places, which tend to define what social work is internationally, or seen as best practice internationally, because that too is very much white still. So yeah, and it's so wonderful to have these conversations with you, and I really hope that everybody is encouraged by these conversations to read the papers and to continue the work on these very important topics. Last but not least, what are you working on at the moment? So Yohai, if we can start with you.
Well, quite a few things, but still we're working on migration of social workers, different aspects of that. But I'm trying to do something again with a group of students around parenting. Again, across cultures, in England, so usually migrating parents, but also white middle-class English parents, and trying to figure out how and in what ways culture shapes parenting, and just to take a slightly broader perspective compared to the usual parenting styles. But let's see what will come out of that.
Excellent. Good luck.
Thank
Corina.
you.
And I'm working on a youth mentoring program for Aboriginal young people on Yorta country, together with Dr. Michelle, which is wonderful because we go on country. On country in Australia means you go to places that are special, sacred, in the bush. And these young people really get connected with their cultures through elders being present and mentors, Aboriginal mentors. So that's a really beautiful project. I'm also working in rural Australia in the Mallee on health outcomes for children and young people in out-of-home care, because we know those outcomes are not as good as for children that grow up in their own families. And then we just have a new project about disclosure of sexual abuse, and that's led by Lynn McPherson also on this paper. So really, and she's at Southern Cross University now, so really keen to start with that study. So lots of different things. It's really good.
Yeah, amazing.
Yes.
Very busy.
So many, and we're doing an international comparison of social work identity with New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, and the Netherlands. So we're hoping to publish about that soon as well. So yes, it's busy, but good. It's good.
Excellent. Wonderful to hear that. And Kate, what are you working on at the moment?
Oh gosh, not that much as that. Trying to get a few projects off the ground. At the moment, I'm really wanting to continue on that work of working with organisations and more towards, always trying to find out more about what is actually happening, but helping to give those skills and those tools for organisations to work with to be able to be self-sustaining in being able to help to make their own workplaces culturally responsive and do that within house, rather than feeling like they need to try and pay for this one size fits all sort of training that isn't necessarily going to be sustainable for them. And currently involved in an Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, so the Ahuri project, which is looking at the housing context for temporary visa holders. So that's just kicking off now, which is exciting.
Excellent. Good luck. I really hope that for all three of you and for your colleagues who publish with you, British Journal of Social Work continues to be your journal of choice. So, and I hope everybody enjoyed this just as much as I did. It's such a joy to talk to all three of you. And thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Pleasure.